On the morning of July 16th, 1945, a man named Darrell Gilmore was driving to his hometown, Tularosa, from the University of New Mexico. His family needed the car to pick up his brother in El Paso, where he was processing out of the Army.
Darrell said, I drove across the desert that day, and he said it was a dirt road, and I drove across the desert that day, and I pulled over at what I now realize was Stallion Gate. He eventually encountered a convoy of Army men, and they told him, roll up the windows and get out of here as quick as you can. Don't stop. There's poison gas in the air. And Darrell thought they were crazy, but he said, I did what they said to do. Rolled up the windows. It's a hot July day. I suffered all the way to Tularosa.
Poison gas wasn't the reason for concern. The gate Darrell had driven past was an entrance to White Sands National Park, where just that morning, the world's first nuclear bomb had been tested.
And he said, but later that day, I realized I had what looked like the worst sunburn of my life, but it was all over my body. And Darrell communicated to me that he had since suffered countless skin cancers, other cancers. Obviously, he received beta burns that day, and it's just mind-blowing that they didn't close that road that day. Who knows how many people traversed across the desert that day on that road.
Sharing Darrell's story with us is Tina Cordova. She's a native of Tularosa, New Mexico, a small town about 45 miles outside of the Trinity test site. She co-founded the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium in 2005 to advocate for those who've experienced illness following radiation exposure from the Trinity test. She's spoken to hundreds of other downwinders, recording their experiences. She spoke with the Bulletin about what happened on the day of the test's legacy for her community, and what downwinders think of Christopher Nolan's film, Oppenheimer. The Trinity bomb had been detonated at 5:30 a.m. that July morning.
Most people have said to me that they thought that it was the end of the world. Many people have said to me that their mothers gathered them up, made them kneel down and pray. People have told me that they were knocked out of bed, that the windows broke, that the dishes fell out of the cupboard. It was a traumatic event.
The test was kept a secret from surrounding communities, who didn't know what to make of the unnatural event. Tina shared what her grandmother recalled.
What she told me was that she remembered for days afterwards an ash fell from the sky. And then our lifestyles were very organic. We lived off the land. We didn't have electricity, so we didn't have running water. We didn't have grocery stores. Everything that we ate, we produced ourselves. Our families worked long hours doing that, especially that time of year. It would have been in the peak of the harvest when people were taking everything they could out of their gardens and their orchards. All of that was contaminated as the ash fell from the sky for the days that it did afterwards.
The government said that the blast was an artillery explosion, a story newspapers published. World War II was still raging, and the US military was concerned about Japan learning of their scientific breakthrough. But on the home front, the cover story didn't explain the sicknesses that followed. Livestock and family dogs died. As years went on, locals began to get cancer. 2 of Tina's great-grandfathers died of stomach cancer, and both her grandmothers developed cancer. Her mother developed cancer of the mouth, and her father suffered from many cancers, from which he eventually died.
When I was 39 years old, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And the first thing they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? Have you ever worked in a lab with radioactive isotopes? Have you had a lot of x-rays? Have you worked in an x-ray facility? And I said, no, and no. But I grew up 45 miles the way the crows fly from the Trinity test site, and I'm certain I had a level of exposure associated with that. I say that we don't ask if we're going to get cancer, we ask when it's going to be our turn.
Younger members of Tina's family have become ill as well, including her 23-year-old niece, who's currently battling thyroid cancer. She's the 5th generation in her family to have developed cancer following the test. This is a story shared by many families who have lived for generations around what became the Trinity test site, as well as other test sites around the nation. But the Trinity Downwinders have a particular distinction. They are not covered by the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA. RECA is a law establishing partial restitution to individuals who developed serious illness after exposure to radiation released during U.S. nuclear tests, or after employment in the uranium industry. But not everyone affected by the tests and the radiation associated are covered. The Bulletin published an article by historian and journalist Leslie Bloom as part of our July 2023 magazine. In writing on the importance of RECA, she included the words of Senator Ben Ray Lujan, a U.S. senator representing New Mexico. Nobody has ever been able to explain to me why New Mexicans were left out of the original RECA legislation. Lujan led a successful bipartisan effort to extend RECA in 2022. This is an issue of justice, of making New Mexicans whole who played a role in our national security. They paid a price for it, their health, livelihoods, and lives. An amendment adding an expansion of RECA to this year's defense budget recently passed in the U.S. Senate. Final passage of the budget and the RECA amendment will be determined by a reconciliation process within the U.S. House of Representatives.
If people could apply for the one-time payment of compassionate restitution of $150,000, that would restore some financial stability. The biggest part, though, is to have access to health care, the very best health care that's available anyplace. We, right now, hold bake sales to buy pain medications. We sell cattle to pay our coinsurance. We, sell our cars so that we can pay the deductible. It's just ridiculous what we go through because we don't have access. And most of us live in rural parts of New Mexico. And so it would mean just this sea change in how people are affected, how they live their lives, the fact that they would potentially develop some generational wealth instead of just being thrust into poverty. If we don't get these bills passed, we will forever be denied the justice that we've been fighting for and that we so deserve.
The Trinity test site was chosen in part due to its presumed remoteness. However, nearly 500,000 people were living within a 150-mile radius of the explosion.
The meteorologists and the physicians assigned to the test were very concerned about human health, but General Groves was not, and they did everything they could to impress upon him how important it was to protect human health, because that's what they were brought on board to do. That was their job.
That's General Leslie R. Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, played by Matt Damon in the film.
People tell me all the time, oh, they didn't know what they were doing, but that is absolutely not true. They already knew, it was a well-established fact, that radiation was dangerous to human health, that there were human health consequences associated with radiation exposure. That was well established. They also knew that the bomb was going to create massive fallout because they did a test run of the bomb in May of 1945 out there. And what they did was they used conventional explosives and they laced it with radiation and they tracked the fallout, and they knew the bomb was going to create fallout.
Following the Trinity test, there is still a tremendous quantity of radioactive dust floating in the air, wrote Manhattan Project Chief Medical Officer Stafford Warren to Groves, adding that a very significant radiation hazard existed within a 2,700 square mile area downwind of the test. Added physicist Kenneth Bainbridge, who oversaw the Trinity test. A large region of the countryside was contaminated by fission products. Despite this, people were not evacuated.
Most people don't understand that if it had not been for the people of New Mexico, there would not have been a Manhattan Project. There would not have been a Trinity. I mean, it's the people from New Mexico that did all the dirty jobs. We're the ones that built all the infrastructure. I always say, they'll not tell the story in the big blockbuster Hollywood movie about how they bust the Native women and the Hispanic women up to Los Alamos every day, and they're the people that cleaned every house, cooked every meal, changed every diaper, and fed every baby bottle. They'll not tell how their husbands were bussed up there too and made to do the dirtiest work. They're the ones that handled radioactive waste. They're the ones that cleaned instrumentation. They'll never tell that part of this history. They won't tell about how ranching families lived 12 miles from the test site and they weren't warned. None of us were warned before or afterwards. They'll not tell that part of the history. And, the Manhattan Project was truly an invasion of our lands and our lives. We were a people that have lived here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They recently discovered footprints at White Sands National Monument, which is literally part of the bombing range where Trinity was detonated, they found footprints there that date back 23,000 years. We're an old population that's been here forever, and the Manhattan Project was a total invasion of our land and our lives. Well, when they came here to film Oppenheimer, it was a very similar invasion of our land and our lives. They exploited the tax incentives. They came here, they filmed the film. We'll see the film, and we'll recognize that it's an overglorification of the science and the scientists, with no reflection on the everyday people whose lives were invaded by the Manhattan Project and the Trinity test.
Daryl Gilmore, who drove past White Sands just hours after the test, passed away a few years ago at the age of 92.
He had horrible, what I call survivor's guilt, because he truly believed he brought the radiation home with him. And he told me my father and mother and my sister all died of cancer later. And I told him, no, Daryl, the ash fell from the sky on Tularosa in those days afterwards. You didn't bring radiation home with you. It fell from the sky for days. And I used to tell Daryl, and there's others like him, that they lived to tell these stories. You know, it's one of those histories that we maintain for the purpose of making sure that no one ever forgets what people like Daryl experienced that day.